So what I wanted to tell you before we started, and I told myself I'd save when we started recording, is that I think one of the convincing things about my position is that I am not involved in hemp and I have no aspirations to be involved in hemp. I simply consume products like these, which shout out to River Bluff Collective. They help to support the show and they send me some of my favorite edibles, including these Bluff Punch Pops. Just a quick plug for people. If you want to acquire this, you can go to riverbluffcollective.com. You must be 21 years of age or older. But just to round out my thought, Rod, before I have you reintroduce yourself, I just found in my conversations with legislators and everybody else that they almost find it a little bit refreshing to speak to me because I'm not like coming to them about how their business is about to die and all of the things that are riding on it. I'm simply making the case that I'm a consumer that has benefited from this unprecedented level of access that the Farm Bill has given me. And I really appreciate it if we didn't lose access to a federally legal commodity. And like from that perspective, they're like, wow, that just makes sense. Like you have nothing to gain except for access to a product you enjoy, you know?
I'm so glad that you take that position. I think it's true because there are plenty of legislators and regulators who are not really understanding what we're the topics we're about to talk about. What's happening with the cannabis industry. There are some that are, but to your point, they typically come from very specific economic positions. And as a consumer, I think one of the things that I sort of preach about with respect to the hemp industry is hemp is the way that we're seeing cannabis be legalized. It's not because it's hemp. This is cannabis, and this is a legal lane that we maybe didn't anticipate, but that the consumers have benefited. And if we kill the hemp industry, then what is going to survive are going to be corporate conglomerates that control the entire supply chain. And while that's really bad for small businesses, and that's a huge piece of what I try to do is support small businesses being able to participate in this market, it's also bad for consumers. If you had a hardware store, have all these small business hardware stores selling, screwdrivers and hammers and all the things that hardware stores sell, and then suddenly there are laws that effectively put them out of business and where you can only sell these same things, if you're Lowe's or Home Depot or something like that. Well, obviously that hurts, small businesses. And I think that's terrible, but it hurts the consumer too, because the consumer loses, at that level of consolidation and closing in on a monopoly, the consumer loses quality, the consumer loses choice, the consumer loses leverage with respect to pricing and on and on and on. So,
Mhm.
the hemp industry truly is not only, favorable to small business and broad access to cannabis, but it's really the industry for the consumers. There are some safety issues that we can talk about and how the hemp industry and the cannabis industry is dealing with that in this emerging market. But in the big picture, this is about consumers as much as it is about small businesses and just the evolution and revolution of the cannabis space.
Yeah. And over the last few weeks, especially following the failure of Amendment 3 in Florida, I've seen a lot of the major cannabis companies either announce, acquisitions in hemp or lean more into hemp. One even said on a cannabis investor show that I watched, the Dales Report, Curaleaf's Boris Jordan was saying, I don't think anybody ever thought of this as the back door to legalization, but should really start thinking of it. And I said, I think somebody did. His name's Rod Kight. I think that's a good way to introduce. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us where we can find you online?
Sure. Thanks. So my name is Rod Kight, Kight, and I'm an attorney. I represent businesses in the cannabis industry, and most of my clients are on the hemp side of the cannabis industry. That's as much as a product of sort of chance over the years. That's a different story as anything. But what I do is I represent businesses and try to and small businesses and try to help them to be compliant and to navigate the ever evolving landscape that's presented itself with respect to cannabis and specifically on the hemp side of things.
Yeah, and just
As
to
far as finding me, yeah. So, cannabusiness.law is my website,
perfect.
not .com, .law. I have a blog that I write, Kite on Cannabis, and it's Kite, Kight on cannabis.com. And as far as reaching me, you can reach me by email, Rod, at cannabusiness.law.
Perfect. And for folks that are listening or watching the show right now, I will have linked Rod's last appearance on this show in the show notes. I'll also have a link to a speech that Rod gave. And Rod, just to briefly talk about the three pillars before we move on, I just want to give you a bit of a softball question. Rod, I have concerns about hemp. It seems like kids can get it and we don't know what's in it, and there could be nasty synthetics. We must ban it. How do you reply to that?
Yeah, well, you know what? I think I agree with a lot of that, except for the banning it, right? So the hemp industry is
There
fairly
you go.
new in terms of industries. The whole cannabis industry is fairly new, and what we saw on sort of one lane, which is the sort of marijuana rescheduling state by state lane, is that a lot of things happened that were unanticipated or negative, and one of those things is significant overregulation and burdensome regulations to businesses. And in most industries, that happens, and it's almost like, at the bottom of a boat, you see the coral start to get, it's really hard to kind of backtrack out of that. Well, in the cannabis industry, we have a do-over. We have another opportunity called hemp to say, oh, well, now that we've had this, a cannabis industry for, whatever, 20 years or so, what regulations are important and what regulations do we not really need? And so the hemp industry needs good regulations. There's this idea out there that the hemp industry is totally unregulated, and that's totally untrue. Some states are highly regulated and some states are not very regulated. What the industry is moving towards is a common set of regulations that, to your point, focus on making sure that minors don't have access to these products, making sure that the products are made safely, so that you can count on the fact that if you go buy a product, you're not inadvertently ingesting pesticides and residual toxins and mycotoxins and all the junk that we don't want. And that the labeling is consistent so that consumer, whether they're in Idaho or South Carolina or California or New York or wherever, can go and say, oh, this is what's in the product. I can read it and I can decide for myself if I want to take that. Those are the three pillars. And most regulations that are being put forth by the hemp industry, and they're being put forth quite significantly right now, incorporate some version of those three pillars. And we need it, and we're moving rapidly towards getting there.
Well said. And, I'm just curious before we get into the latest policy developments. This is a thought that I recently had, Rod, and I'm sure it's one that's spun around your head in the past, but I'm not trying to get too into the debate itself, but I just keep it high level, right? A lot of people, and you've touched on this in our conversation in the past, which I'll once again mention is in the show notes. People definitely check it out. There's constantly this debate about intent, and I'm of the belief it's like fuck intent, take the win for what it is, right? Because I feel like if you're really going to get tied up in intent in 1996, when somebody stubbed their toe and asked for a medical cannabis card, you would have said, whoa, whoa, whoa. Hey, that's not the intent of the lawmakers. No, even the most OG, for a lack of a better word or phrase, cannabis activists have admitted medical cannabis was the Trojan horse for adult use cannabis. And I'm of the view, again, let's take the win where we can get it, as you've laid out in your case many times. Like the Farm Bill and hemp seems to be the Trojan horse for descheduled cannabis. In fact, I saw somebody today say basically what I just said, much shorter. They're like, if we just start calling it hemp, we don't have to deal with all of these burdensome things. Like, is it really that big of a deal to call it hemp?
Right. I love that. I love your idea about sort of the stub toe. I haven't thought about that. And to be clear, cannabis has medical utility,
Of
but I
course.
think it
Yeah.
was the Trojan horse. People, no one wanted to stop at just mere, medical marijuana. They wanted adult use. And with hemp, as soon as we realized what the law could offer, we wanted to push that forward. Those of us who really truly believe in cannabis reform. And so, you talk about the expression, hey, this is a gift and let's use it. There's an old expression called "Don't look a gift horse in the mouth," which essentially means, if you have a gift, don't question it. And we were given a gift with the 2018 Farm Bill by Congress, and regardless of congressional intent, we have, almost full legalization of cannabis in the United States. why in the world would anyone who believes in cannabis as the plant, as medicine, as a civil liberty, a right to use, as a business to sell it, anyone who believes in that, should be appreciative and happy and, hey, let's take this thing. And what I found is that the people who oppose that, there's and I think you and I talked about this the last time, there are sort of people that will always be opposed to intoxicants, and that's just going to be a portion of the population. There are people that don't understand, and I think part of what we're doing and what I really appreciate about you doing is helping to people to understand this new paradigm and sort of open their understanding of this. But then the biggest sort of opponent really is the economic interests
Yeah.
there. So it's weird to me when a company or a person, a prominent person who is in the cannabis business, who's their whole world is cannabis, say, oh no, we should quote unquote close the loophole and eliminate an enormous swath of cannabis from the public and from businesses. That doesn't make any sense at all unless you have an economic interest in the position as it is. And so, I think people could just to kind of finish out this thought, people could levy the same argument against me and hemp industry participants. Oh yeah, but you have a vested interest. Of course, this is a business, but the vested interest in hemp is to expand and normalize cannabis, so that small businesses, consumers throughout the country can access it. And if there are people on the marijuana side that want to participate in it, we don't try to craft laws to keep them out. We're like, come on, join it. And Curaleaf, I applaud Curaleaf, frankly, for being an early adopter as an MSO into the hemp space. I think GTI has done the same,
Hmm.
and I think it really just a matter of time before they all are doing it. It doesn't make any economic sense for them not to, and the failure of Florida to pass adult use sort of showed them, oh, we can't necessarily sort of continue to lobby against hemp and competition and try to impose our sort of monopoly on the country. I think we're going to have to pivot and figure out how to make a living in this world of hemp, which is moving towards full and total legalization.
Yeah. Like you say, a lot of people getting involved. Glass House, Wana, Cookies, brand names that people just recognize just by looking at them. Any like wine mom can look at Wanas and be like, "Oh, those are the gummies, right?" Um, to your point, some of these cannabis operators have. Well, before I say that, I wanted to start on your first point. One thing that I find interesting as you see more and more of these big companies come over, hop the fence, let's say one thing you're not hearing from hempers is, "Hey, you're not allowed on this side of the fence." But you hear that on the cannabis side of the fence. Like, no, we limit participation and only a certain number of people can participate. And in fact, a lot of these companies, actually, that's why I find it so notable, have previously left open markets like Oregon, California, Michigan, Colorado, more competitive open markets they tend to avoid. And so to see them lean into hemp, I can't help but wonder, is this a change in strategy? Because that's how they pitch themselves to their investors. We go in highly limited, regulated markets with barriers to entry, and going into hemp, it's kind of the polar opposite of exactly that.
It is the polar opposite. So it'll be interesting to see if it will the lobbying strategies of some of the corporate conglomerates be, rather than sort of eliminating hemp as that strategy doesn't seem to be working for them, will it be to create higher barriers within the hemp industry? And I think that the cat's out of the bag, to use another phrase or expression on that. I think that would be pretty difficult to do. Now, again, to go back to the regulations, there are reasonable regulations that everyone in the hemp industry should comply with, and that is a barrier of sorts. If your products need to be manufactured in CGMP conditions, well, some people just don't have the wherewithal or the resources to do that. But again, that's a reasonable barrier to entry. It's not a manufactured artificial barrier to keep out your competition.
Right. And that's the main difference. The artificial barriers that are meant to artificially inflate the price of product. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? And
right.
it's funny. I had a conversation, I won't name them, but it's a good friend of mine and he's in the cannabis industry. And after about 10 minutes of bitching about hemp and saying that it's caused price compression, he told me that he plans to soon announce a hemp product.
Right. Can't beat them, join them, right? The
That's it.
cannabis
Yeah.
industry right now is it's in a difficult spot because one of the reasons is sort of pricing. And is that because of hemp? The abundance of hemp and new businesses entering the space may be a piece of that, but prices were artificially high for a long time. And the black market was competing with a lot of the adult use, markets and so on and so forth. But I think the question goes back to, do you believe in the free market or not? Not everyone's going to survive in a free market. There are going to be, there's going to be pricing and quality and market. There's all these issues. And right now we're sort of in the early phases, and we'll be able to look back 10, 20 years and say, oh, well, this is how it all played out. And these are the companies that sort of made it through. And some of them won't make it. But that's a natural process, a natural economic process of free market with reasonable regulations versus, again, the artificial process of creating onerous regulations and onerous hurdles so that only a small handful of corporate conglomerates can control. That's different. That's not the free market. An artificially created market.
Yeah. And one of the only other things I wanted to discuss with you before we went over to the latest in like policy news at a high level, um, is, man, I think I just lost it. I'm so sorry. I've got it noted. The latest in hemp news. You were just talking about price compression. Damn, it is gone. I guess I think it's starting to come back to me. It's okay, there it is. The free market, I do have one concern with the free market, and I'm curious if you think there are already like mechanisms to address my concern. My concern with the free market, and admittedly, just like any other cannabis industry regulation, the one I'm about to list to you is flawed. But I
Mhm.
like the concept, and it's the concept of owner limitations, not license limitations, but
Mhm.
owner limitations. In Illinois, you're allowed to have 10 dispensaries, 3 cultivation centers, and that's the size of it. Like if
Mhm.
you increase, and the idea is to prevent one operator from becoming any larger than another. Not that there won't be big operators, but
Mhm.
your footprint maximum is always going to be the same. My question is, do you think because I'm thinking of like the FTC, do you think there are already mechanisms in which we would deal with that at a federal level, or like what's just your general idea on that? Those are my only concerns with a free market approach is just
Yeah.
seeing what's happened in other industries happen here, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's a super valid question. And when I talk about the free market, there's probably no such thing, certainly in the United States or in most of the
Sure.
world, with a true sort of free market. There's
Sure.
no regulations, there's no barriers to entry. Everyone just a free for all. That's a sort of an economist, an economic philosophy sort of a zone up there. Every market is regulated, and it's just a matter of to what degree and what regulations make sense and what are the goals of the regulation. And so, in terms of the Illinois regulations that you're talking about, I think that Illinois has done a lot of difficult things with respect to its cannabis industry. I do like the idea of putting in some barriers so that no one company becomes so big that it is effectively a monopoly. I don't like monopolies, and I don't think that other people should either. For they're bad for a lot of reasons, and so trying to stem that I think is good. Is limiting the number of grow houses or dispensaries or whatever that you can have the right way to go? I mean, there's arguments pro and con
Sure.
about that. I think the question would be, is there any data to back that up? And this type of regulation limitation is really truly effectuates that policy or not, and how big should something come? So I get
Hmm.
concerned with the details, but I think in terms of making sure that small businesses still have access, I think those are laudable goals from a policy standpoint.
Yeah. And again, admittedly, like Illinois specifically, it's funny, they have that, but then they also are not transparent or open about anybody who owns the licenses. Like if you try to FOIA that to like, let's just say audit the regulators
Mhm.
to make sure that nobody's over their 10 and 3, their 10, dispensary and 3 cultivation limit. Good luck trying to figure that out. You kind of just have to
Yeah.
trust the regulators. And then past that, I guess what I'm trying to say is again, it's not that we both don't agree that this is a fuzzy and nice idea. It's that it starts to fall apart when you realize what people can do with like shell companies and everything else. It's like, what kind of cat and mouse game are we going to sign ourselves up for with that? You know?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And there are, imperfect mechanisms for dealing with monopolies at the federal level. I mean, you see, the Department of Justice coming in and doing, trust busting, to use an old school term about monopolies with respect to, oh, there's a merger between these two major media organizations. Is the DOJ going to allow that? Are they going to break up this company that's gotten too big? I mean, there are mechanisms, and again, pros and cons, all that kind of stuff. Illinois has been particularly difficult. I know with respect to its social equity, provisions, it's really has not done well by its social equity participants. And there's a new lawsuit out there that's challenging some of the ways that Illinois has gone about it. So, Illinois is not perfect. There is not a perfect state right now. I wish that Illinois was more transparent, and I wish that it was embracing hemp more. But the fact of the matter is that Illinois is, if there was ever a home to MSOs, it's Illinois, right?
Hmm.
And so that's one of the reasons I think that Illinois is a difficult state. But by the same token, it's got a really active cannabis community that's willing to file lawsuits, that's willing to take the regulators and law enforcement to task, that's willing to lobby in favor of reasonable and policies and so on and so forth. So it's in a lot of ways a microcosm of the whole that we're seeing in the United States right now.
Yeah, and for listeners that are curious to learn more about the lawsuit, I'll try to have it linked in the show notes, but stay tuned. I'll be sitting down with the lawyer and some of the plaintiffs. I think that's the correct term. Uh, Next week. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be fun. We'll be talking about that super messed up case. They definitely have a solid. What I mean to say is they have a solid case. It's super messed up what the
Mhm.
state of Illinois did. And by the way, folks, just another quick plug. If you want to learn just how badly Illinois messed up legalization, I just released my mini documentary. You can watch it at colememo.com/mini doc. It's just 1 hour and you'll get my the last 5 years of my work kind of in a package. So check that out.
Excited to
Um,
see that.
yeah, and thanks again for your time today, Rod. I really appreciate your time and just what you do. So I wanted to talk about the latest in national news. Before I do that, though, just to keep it local, I recently heard you on the Texas Hemp Show, and I was listening just because I'm a fan of yours. And you were like, I just recently spoke to local law enforcement in Illinois, and you kind of moved on. I'd love to hear about that. What was the conversation like or about, or as much as you can tell me?
So yeah, it had to do with THCA flower and a seizure. So I have a lot of clients that are shipping hemp across state lines. Maybe it's grown and out west, and it's being shipped to parts in the Midwest or in the East, and the shipment will get seized. By law enforcement, and then they test it. They use gas chromatography. They decarb it. They say, oh no, this is marijuana, so on and so forth. And so it's a fairly regular occurrence that a client will call me and say, hey, we got a package that was seized. Here's the information. And unfortunately, it's a really difficult situation to work through. But in this instance, we had the name of the law enforcement agency and, in fact, the officer that was handling this. And I told my client, absolutely, I'll call and talk to him. And I prepped my client, like, by the way, don't expect anything. Just because some lawyer calls the law enforcement agent and says, hey, you're wrong, and here's what it really needs to happen, they're going to either politely say thank you and goodbye, or they're going to get into an argument with me, and it's not going to go anywhere, and we'll have to go through the process. So with that as the sort of preface, I reached out to this officer who was very cordial, very nice. Illinoisans and Midwesterners have a good reputation for being nice and whatnot. And we're talking, and he asked some questions, and I got the sense that the questions he was asking were legitimate. Like he really wanted to know. So I started talking to him about decarboxylation and the what's required prior to harvest and post harvest and all of these things. He listened, and as it turns out, he thanked me. And then within, I forget the time period, a couple, 3 weeks, he released the product back to my client. It was phenomenal. I'll just tell you that rarely happens. Typically you have to go through a long and arduous legal process that sometimes you don't prevail just because there's a lot of lack of understanding out there with respect to law enforcement and judges and everyone else. So That's a long way of saying I had a great conversation with law enforcement. There are really good law enforcement officers out there that want to do the right thing. They are tasked with enforcing laws that are coming at them very quickly with a lot of technical pieces, a lot of scientific pieces, and they've got to do this whole they've got to this whole breadth of society and all these laws, and they're expected to know these really super technical things. And so I feel for them, and I really appreciate it when law enforcement is willing to listen and engage in a civil conversation. And that's what happened. And it was out of Illinois.
That's cool. That's cool. I'm just curious, just because you made me think of it. I've had other lawyers on the show, and they've told me that, and I'm not even asking like from your perspective. It doesn't have to be from Illinois, just in any state that you've worked in. Have you ever been able to like get people out of criminal charges on the basis that they are possessing hemp? Like, um, yeah, kind of like
Yeah.
that
So
concept.
personally, no, because I don't practice criminal law. So,
Fair.
and I think that's an understanding. A lot of people will call me, hey, my boyfriend got pulled over and he has hemp and he's in jail and whatever. And I understand because I speak about these things, but I represent businesses and help them navigate the regulations. Now, that being said, I often, provide sort of legal guidance to criminal lawyers who have cases like this,
Sure.
and they either just know a little bit or sometimes they don't know anything, and they're like, hey, my client said that I should call you. And so I help them to talk that through, and that has actually been significantly helpful, I think, to people in those situations. I'll say when it comes, this is a very broad sort of statement, but I think it's generally true. When it comes to criminal charges about hemp and hemp products, those occur, and there are people that are wrongfully, convicted of crimes. But because of the standards and the fact that the law is complex, sometimes it's gray, and sometimes it's just really clear, it's just misapplied. Um, Criminal charges tend to be the lesser of the concerns than seizures of product. And so in the US, in order for someone to be convicted of a crime, they have to be the prosecution has to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the crime was committed. And that's essentially, that's the highest standard in the law. If there's any doubt at all, well, then they get off. And so it's really difficult for a prosecutor to convict someone of a hemp crime as long as the person was doing the right things and has the right evidence. Okay. On the other hand, seizures of material, asset forfeitures, and things like that have a lower standard that law enforcement has to prove. And so someone could be, have their criminal charges dismissed, but still have their product lawfully, unfortunately, seized or forfeited under the same set of circumstances because of the different standards in the law. And sorry, I don't mean to get into wonky legal details and standards and that kind of stuff, but it is important because people sometimes don't understand. Wait a second. The charges were dismissed. When am I getting my product back? Oh, guess what? You're not getting your product back, unfortunately. So those are problems that are endemic to the criminal justice system generally, and they're being played out in the hemp industry right now.
Cool. Well, thank you for getting into that. No need to apologize. We love getting into the details like that. And I'm obviously not qualified to give legal advice. You just said you're not a criminal defense lawyer, but one of the criminal defense lawyers we had on the show in the past, and I just to put it plainly for people, put it shortly, like when a law enforcement officer pulls you over, you can't just say like, "Hey, I'm smoking on a THC pre-roll." Like they are going to view that the same as if they pulled you over with O'Doul's. You can try as hard as you want to explain that it's a non-alcoholic beer, but you're going to have to prove that in court, and you better be ready to pay to prove that in court. And so that's why I wanted to. I'm glad we got into that. Again, not that either of us can really. It sounds like give or want to give legal advice today. But I think that's a really simple lens to look at this through. Do you agree? Where it's like, don't try to win an argument on the side of the road because you're going to have to go to court. You're not going to beat the ride.
No, that's exactly right. And one of the things that we're seeing in the hemp industry is this idea of probable cause. And so, there are kind of two ways that if you're, let's just say pulled over, like you said, just, and let's say you're pulled over and you've got a bag of cannabis material right there in the front. The law enforcement officer has two options in terms of searching the car. Again, we're talking very broadly. One is to go get a search warrant, go to a judge. Hey, judge, this is the information I have. issue a search warrant, and then the judge says yes or no. It says yes, then that officer can search the car. The other is if the officer has probable cause to believe that a crime is being committed. And it used to be that the mere appearance or the smell of cannabis was sufficient probable cause to believe that the person was in possession of an illegal drug, right? Because all cannabis used to be illegal.
Right.
Well, nowadays in the advent of hemp, which is cannabis, um, an officer looks down and sees, what looks like weed or smells it. Is that probable cause or not? And in some states, the courts are rightly saying no, that's not enough probable cause because it could be hemp, it could be marijuana. You don't know. You have no way of knowing. Your drug dogs can't tell because they can't sniff concentrations of THC, which is colorless and odorless anyway. And the point I'm driving at is some courts in my home state of North Carolina being one of them have found that it is probable cause. That if you have a pre-roll of cannabis or a baggie of cannabis, that is probable cause, the officer can seize it. And of course, what happens then is officers, then they go test it and they use gas chromatography, they decarb it. It looks to them like illegal marijuana. So to circle all the way back down to your point, the best thing that you can do if you're pulled over is to just say nothing, or at a minimum, just say, this is hemp, and then say nothing, and let it, they're going to do what they're going to do. And you don't want to give them fodder that they could use against you. And by and large, most of what you say, they'll use against you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Everything you say can and will be used against you. I learned that
That's
on
exactly
Cops,
right.
the show.
And it's
Anyways,
true. Yeah.
anyways, well, let's talk, just off the top of your head to close the show. I wanted to talk about the latest in hemp news across the states, and then of course, we've heard about the Wyden bill. I don't know that
Mhm.
I've covered it specifically on this show before, so where do you want to start? You want to start federal? You want to start and go through the states to close?
Um, let's talk about a federal, actually, let's talk about two court cases, one federal case and one state case that I think are kind of helping just to understand maybe where we're going. So one federal case I want to talk about is the Anderson case out of the Fourth Circuit. So for those of you that are listening, in the federal system, we have district courts, which are trial courts. When you have a case there and you appeal it to the circuit court, and there are different circuits that cover multiple states, and then you appeal from there to the U.S. Supreme Court. That's it. It's like a triangle: Supreme Court, circuit courts, district courts. So the Fourth Circuit, this is a case coming out of the Fourth Circuit. The Fourth Circuit covers South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia. Because of its position in the region and culturally, it's one of the most, if not the most conservative court in the country, as opposed to the Ninth Circuit, which is California, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, Nevada, which is what you typically seen as the most liberal court. Well, several years ago, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in a decision called AK Futures that Delta 8 THC was not a controlled substance. That sent shockwaves throughout the industry. Well, since then, I had a question and I wrote to the DEA. I didn't, wanted to see what the DEA's position was on THCO. I wanted to understand if the DEA contended that THCO was legal or not. Well, not surprisingly, the DEA said THCO is illegal. They contend that it's a form of synthetic THC. Well, then out of nowhere, just literally a couple months ago, a case came through the Fourth Circuit where the Fourth Circuit found that THCO from hemp is in fact not a controlled substance. It's actually qualifies as legal hemp. It's not synthetic THC. The details of the case, it arises out of an employment case where the person was discharged based on them finding cannabis, marijuana in her blood, and she said no, I was using hemp products, and one of the products was THCO, and the company said a THCO has been determined by the DEA to be illegal, so you were using an illegal product, so we can fire you. And the Fourth Circuit said no. And notably, the Fourth Circuit quoted the AK Futures decision this is the most conservative circuit court quoting the most liberal circuit court, which rarely happens, about this. And so it sort of opened up and said, we're not always going to just listen to what the DEA says about something. We're going to look at the statute, and by a plain reading of the statute, whether people agree that this should or should not be the case, THCO is legal. It meets the definition of hemp, and that's what the Fourth Circuit said. So that was unexpected and also pretty notable in the community. So that's, as we're starting to define what hemp means, what are the parameters for cannabis and the brownie, that's one big case. Just about a week ago, on the other side of the country, in a state court of appeals in California just had this opinion where the judge said, and I'm going to read it because I think it's pretty wild. This is okay. It was released on October 29th, 2024. And the opinion starts like this. Many Californians have high expectations that cannabis is legal in California. This is a reasonable assumption because Civil Code Section 1550.5 says it is. We regret to inform that cannabis is illegal in California because federal law says so. Like, that's a California court saying that cannabis is illegal in California. Now, as a quick aside, cannabis is not illegal in California. Cannabis is a botanical term. Marijuana and hemp, the judge meant to say marijuana, but for our purposes, we'll just kind of slip over that. So, on the one side of the country, the conservative side of the country, we've got this expansion of what it means to be for legal cannabis. On the other side of a country, in a different court, different circumstances, that case had to deal with an easement, the right of someone to cross over someone else's land. In this case, someone who had a marijuana processing facility to cross over someone else's land legally, and there was an opposition. The court said, no, you can't. The owner of the land says that they don't want illegal materials coming across the state. And yes, guess what? Cannabis is illegal in California. It's just mind blowing what's happening in cannabis right now. So I'll just throw those two cases out right now as recent cases that are kind of mind benders for, I think, anyone who thought they knew where cannabis was going and what states and what sections of the country were more or less progressive.
Yeah, and I'm curious, if it's speculative or you're just not sure, it's all right. But, California led the way, it seemed like, with Gavin Newsom coming out and doing that the ban by executive order. First of all, am I right in saying that that's the first time a governor has come out and banned hemp? Usually I feel like it's at the legislature that you see that. And then my second question is like, do you know what's happening with that? Is that going to be overturned?
Great question. I don't know if it's the first. The lame duck governor of Missouri, whose name escapes me now, issued an executive order around the same time. I think it might have been a little bit before.
Yeah, and did that
Excuse me.
spawn the whole raid at the VA and all that stuff? Am I
Yeah,
wrong
a
there?
lot of fallout from that. But what's the fallout in the Missouri case has been that there was this wide ranging, executive order that essentially just shut down the hemp industry. And then that's been backed off. And what we're looking at now is proposed regulations from the Missouri Hemp Association that I think are very reasonable and are excellent. And products for the most part are legally being allowed to be sold. There's not a lot of enforcement from the top of the Missouri executive order. Gavin Newsom, governor of California, issued again a very broad-ranging executive order that said that any product that contains any food product that contains any detectable level of THC is illegal in the state. And a lot of people say, well, we don't sell in California. We just, manufacture in the state, or we just distribute out of the state. Well, by a plain reading of that, that's illegal as well. We don't know if California is going to enforce that, but a lot of my California clients are understandably very concerned. Like, do we move? Do we just kind of lay low? Do we stop our production? Blah blah blah. But to answer your question, the U.S. Hemp Roundtable filed, and some others filed an action against that to have it set aside, and unfortunately, at least in seeking an injunction, did not prevail. So that executive order right now in California stands, and it just kind of goes to show you where entrenched positions can lead you. So here's California, arguably the leader in cannabis reform for the whole world for 2 decades, is now rapidly, going from the very top to one of the bottom in terms of cannabis reform and what needs to happen in the cannabis industry. So we've got California clients, just leaving California in droves.
It's insane, and it makes me worried in a state like Illinois where it doesn't seem like any of the big cannabis companies surprisingly have the governor's ear yet. You know, he's saying they need to be regulated, but he hasn't said what the cannabis regulation oversight is. I'll restart that. He has not said what our cannabis regulation oversight office has said, which is they take it a step further. They don't say just we need regulation. They say this is a competitor to our social equity licensees. So again, they make it about an economic thing, right? Instead of
Mhm.
just being like, hey, we got public health, public safety concerns, let's address those. They take it a step
Right.
further and make it about how the market is structured. And so, like I say, he doesn't seem to be of that mindset right now. At least the last few times he's been asked about it, he's just plainly said, yeah, if these are kind of loosely regulated, they should probably be more regulated. But yeah, I worry that a governor like him sees what Newsom has done. And like I'm scared about saying it right now, honestly. I want to speak
Right.
it into existence, but
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, from a strategic standpoint, if you're losing at with these ballot measures, if you're losing in terms of legislative, lobbying, well, then maybe your next play is, if you're is to go to a governor of state X and say, there's a public health crisis, or they're, down trotting on the trotting on the rights of the social equity applicants, which is kind of ironic coming from Illinois, but you'll
right.
have that conversation next week with your
Yeah,
next
yeah.
guest. And convincing a governor to issue these blanket executive orders, that's very scary, because then, you've got a process that's in play. I mean, every single new industry, and the cannabis industry, and certainly the hemp section of it, is a very new industry, goes through these growing pains. No legitimate players in the hemp industry think that there should be no regulations for hemp. It's just a matter of what the appropriate regulations are, and those are rapidly coming into play. But in the meantime, you're having sort of these, governors come in and just pull the rug out from underneath the industry, and that's terrible, and that's causing a lot of harm and a lot of damage. And I certainly hope that there's, that is was sort of a blip, and it's not going to be the future of cannabis in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, we'll close out the show here soon, but I wanted to give you more space. I've seen Texas. This is an interesting story. I'm going to have somebody from Texas on in the future. Just curious if you know about this. The city of Dallas not only decriminalized the possession of 4 ounces of cannabis, but they also, I believe I read, prevented law enforcement's ability from being able to determine whether the cannabis in question is marijuana legally or hemp legally. Like it's decriminalized.
It's amazing, isn't it? So there's this crazy battle going on between the mayors of some of the bigger cities in Texas, and I believe the governor, at least the governor's office, about this. So, Austin had decriminalized, I think still is. Dallas just really came out. There's some news stories about that. To your point, I'm not sure if Houston or some others, but anyway, these cities are doing that, and the governor's position is you can't do this, and there's this sort of legal battle. But I love it. I think it's phenomenal. And it shows you again where the priorities are. The priorities are not in trying to bust people who have cannabis that very well may be completely lawful hemp. Priorities should be elsewhere. And it's also interesting to take this story in context with another story, which is in Allen, Texas, which is, a relatively nearby area. My Texas geography isn't great, and Texas is big, and everything is far away and close at the same time. But
Yeah.
anyway, Allen, Texas, law enforcement there, in conjunction with the DEA, raided dozens and dozens of smoke shops. Alleging that they were selling illegal marijuana products, they're selling to minors, and so on and so forth. And there's a colleague of mine, David Sergi, has filed a lawsuit against law enforcement for its actions. So here you have Allen, raiding these smoke shops, not really caring about going about and testing these products and going about enforcement the right way. And then you have Dallas that says, this is ridiculous. We're not even going to worry about this. These are the positions, and that's a microcosm of the macrocosm that's happening right now in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, to give you because I know I kicked it to a specific topic, any other states, I think I saw um, Ohio might be doing something. You mentioned New Jersey. Any other big thoughts that come to mind just in between the last times we've spoken?
Yeah, sure. So Ohio has a bill that would be devastating for the hemp industry there. New Jersey passed a bill. There was a lawsuit that challenged it. They sought the plaintiffs, the hemp industry participants, sought an injunction. They didn't get the full injunction. They got a little bit of relief. But I think, what's playing out now that we're seeing, there's the Texas thing, there's the Ohio thing, there's a New Jersey thing, there's the California thing. This is all, we're going to see more of this. We're going to see more lawsuits. We're going to see more regulatory actions. And notably, come 2025, we're going to see state legislatures throughout the country debating these very issues. And we're going to see the full spectrum of possibilities. We're going to see a lot of lobbying to kill the hemp industry or severely limit it. And we're going to see a lot of lobbying to open it up dramatically. We're going to see lobbying to keep the same. We're going to see lobbying to impose these regulations. And so I think 2025, particularly in the spring and going into summer, is going to be really, really busy and active. And if you're in the hemp industry, then it is incumbent upon you to pay attention, because probably most states are going to be focused on this in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, well said. Well, I've got one quick question, and then we'll close with the federal level. Just like maybe a brief discussion on Wyden bill and what the future might look like, which I know is hard to say. So maybe cook that in the back of your head. But I'm curious on your take on this. I know that I take you more of somebody who, provides information and fights the good fight, as I like to say. But you've radicalized me with your three pillar approach. It's like my foundation. I can duck and weave and stay in the pocket on it, man. It's all bases are covered with that, right? I'm curious, like how you would, like what advice you'd give me. So there are three proposals in Illinois right now that I know of that relate to hemp. One of them is of the view that hemp is a competitor to social equity licensees. So what we need to do is make all cannabinoids be sold by all the licensees under the Cannabis Act, right? So it basically just shuts down. They call it regulation, but it shuts down the hemp industry.
Right.
Then you've got a proposal that's like, hey, we'll allow more licensees, but we're going to have dosage caps, and we're going to kind of be like, the low dose option, man. We don't want to get in your way, man. We're going to get people in your stores. That's kind of how they're pitching it. You might call that a middle ground, because they're trying to like say like, hey, we still sell hemp, but we're just gonna settle down and do, low dose. And then there's one proposal that was recently announced that just codifies the Farm Bill and adds an age gate for ingestibles and smokables, adds quality controls, adds transparent labeling. It's your three pillar approach. It's just what it is. So obviously, I think your advice would be, cool, support that one. But I'm curious, is there such thing as being too like picky? Like I like, debate the people that have put out the other bill, because I'm like, what's up with the potency caps? And they're like, we have to do this. The cannabis industry won't agree to anything less. And I'm like, but all right, what do you have any advice on this? Like, am I being too pure?
I think you're right on point. So I think, to me, it's unsurprisingly, the third option sounds like the right one. It's regulations that supports the industry and allows adults to make choices about what they choose to consume. The first option, where you sort of, take it all away, I think is,
Except for online
is
sales, by
difficult.
the way. That's the one thing they said, that we're not going to prevent online sales. Like, you can still buy from other states, but everything's sold in Illinois. I just wanted to say that. It's kind of funny,
That's even worse for Illinoisans. I mean, that's
right?
terrible. So, I think that we're far enough along that that's just a taking that literally takes, people who have invested in a legal industry under the laws as they are now, and saying, oh, never mind, pull the rug out from, you're done. I think that's unfair and wrong for a lot of reasons. I think the really interesting one to talk about, there's a second social equity piece to that. I think it's worth speaking about that just for a second.
Yeah.
The hemp industry has been, maligned for not really addressing social equity. And I think that there's some truth in that I want to acknowledge. And that is, I think most people say, well, social equity is baked into the hemp pie because there aren't really barriers to entry. There's some small barriers to entry, but everyone can participate. So this is by definition socially equitable. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I understand that position. By the same token, there have been communities that have been, really seen the brunt of prosecutions and the drug war, and we need to address that. And I have talked with a lot of people about different approaches, and I haven't yet to see a perfect approach. But I think that any approach that doesn't deal with social equity on some level is is not the perfect approach. So I think we need to do that. Again, taking small businesses away from an entire swath of the community, and then throwing it in under the guise of this is for social equity, I think is wrong. And I don't think that that's correct. And I don't think it's really about social equity for the lobbyists anyway. The really interesting one, that was this middle one, like, well, let's have some more stringent regulations, and specifically with milligram caps and things like that. And I think there's a sense that there's sort of a feel good approach to that. Like, who needs to be taking 100 milligrams of THC? That's ridiculous.
Right.
Well, I get that, but different people need different things. And I really hate using the alcohol example, but I think it's apropos here. And that is, if I want to go buy a session beer, I can buy a session beer. On the other hand, if I want to go buy a bottle of Everclear, I can buy a bottle of Everclear, and I make the decision for myself. And this is a toxic substance, right? About what I consume. So why can't I do the same thing? Oh, I want, 2.5 milligrams of THC to help, take the edge off, before bed, or I want 100 milligrams of THC because I've got a lot of pain, chronic pain that I'm dealing with, and that's the only thing that seems to help. I just think that it's just being a nanny state, and it's unnecessary. That being said, milligram caps, for better or for worse, tend to be the trend. It may be that we have to live with them, but I would caution the industry before conceding that too quickly, because part of the problems with the marijuana side of the cannabis industry is in the zeal and the desire to legalize and get things moving into business. I think that the marijuana industry accepted too many regulations, and now they're seeing the fruit of that, which is disaster. And so if the hemp industry falls prey to that and starts agreeing to onerous, ridiculous milligram caps and everything else, I think, down the road, 5-10 years from now, we're going to say, oh, why did we do this? And one final example about that is, I was talking to a friend of mine who's in the beverage space. You opened up our the podcast showing a supporter, and I love, hemp derived beverages. I asked a friend of mine who's in the industry, what about this milligram cap thing? Talking about the same thing we're talking about now. And he said, hey, listen, it makes sense. Okay, a seltzer, maybe 5 or 10 milligrams is sufficient. That kind of hits the sweet spot of what most people like. By the way, a lot of people like the 50 milligram seltzers for whatever reason. But think about this, Rod. And he said, if you go to a bar, a lot of times they're just going to pull a fifth of vodka or whatever, and they're going to pour a shot and make your drink, put it back. Well, what if, there already are bars of sorts for THC beverages, and things like that. Well, how if there's a milligram cap, well, then how do we deal with that? Can't you, what's wrong with going to a bar and there's a huge thing and it might have 500 milligrams of THC, but you're just pouring a shot and mixing drinks with that? Isn't that a world that we want to see? People are using less alcohol, using more THC, and with the milligram caps on beverages in just this, example, that would completely derail that as a reality for us to pursue. So, that's a long-winded lawyer, blah, 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 to say that I think the milligram caps and those types of things, while they might seem to be reasonable at first blush, sort of our instinctual response, I think it's important to step back and say, really, should we agree to this, and only agree if you absolutely have to in order to effectuate the greater goal, which is, legalization of cannabis and normalization of it.
Yeah. Well, hey, let's close with a quick federal roundtable, if we will.
All right.
Any large strokes on the Wyden bill? Does it meet the three pillar approach, or are there any arbitrary like caps? That's my big question, because it's hard for me to read through a big proposal like that. So
Yeah, I think in its intent and its focus on, let's have let's regulate hemp from the federal level. Let's bring it into normalcy. Let's kind of pull, let's cut against this idea that it's some sort of a loophole. I think Wyden did a great job. I think generally speaking, it hits the high points. Like most bills, this bill has some problems, and I think there are some even fatal problems with the Wyden bill. Most notably, it appears to require total THC testing, which would
mm,
decimate certainly the flower side of the industry, and it has some other things that I think are not right. Um, but it's not going to get passed. So, I think it's like, hey, let's shoot this shot across the bow. Come 2025, let's tweak it and adjust it and make it really the bill that we want. So kudos to Wyden and his team for doing this, but please, let's fix it before we pass it.
And when you say one of the points you've stated in the past, when people just very quickly, when people debate intent, you've stated something to the fact of like, look, they could have amended it. They could have made comments on the record. Nobody involved has done anything like that. Is that a correct, before I ask my question, is that a pretty correct synopsis of like, if you really want to question intent, like they've had ample opportunity to clarify their intent and they've not done that. They've
Yeah, no,
settled with.
absolutely.
So, so then to add to that, I mean, Wyden, am I wrong in saying he was involved in the original Farm Bill? So for him to bring up some of this language again, like that seems like as close as you're going to get to a statement of intent. Like, as you say, there's some bad things in it, but the fact that
Mhm.
it doesn't maybe affect the edible market or something like that, that seems like, you
Yeah, I
know,
mean, it acknowledges that there is a cannabis industry that's the hemp industry
mhm.
that sells and distributes intoxicating cannabinoids, and it doesn't say, "Oh, this was a big mistake." It says, "Yeah, that was right to your point. This we intended that, and here's a bill to sort of further put out the parameters because we've got so much chaos happening at the state level." So yeah, and Wyden's been a big supporter of hemp. He helped us in some litigation with the DEA. His office wrote a letter about some of their, what they intended when they enacted the 2018 Farm Bill and with respect to in process hemp extract and things like that. So Wyden's been a big supporter, and I think that exactly it does show that there was this intent. And while we're on the intent thing, real fast, I'll say, you can't take the 2018 Farm Bill in a vacuum. There was a 2014 Farm Bill that
Right.
legalized industrial hemp, and it was a very short definition of hemp. And after seeing the market evolve to cannabinoid focus and all that, Congress certainly had an opportunity to either keep that, eliminate it, change it, and Congress changed it, removed the term industrial, and then went into great detail. Let's say that cannabinoids and extracts and derivatives and isomers and salts of isomers and all that are legal. So if there is an intent to be read into the Farm Bill, it is that this market was intended to be out there. And a lot of people will argue with me about that, and that's fine. Ultimately, it doesn't matter because the law is very clear. It says what it says. It's unambiguous, and that's what we're running with. To kind of go back to the beginning of the show, we've been given this gift, and those of us who are reformers, this is fantastic.
Yeah. So my last question, and again, I've had this one cooking for you. I don't even know how to ask it because it's like it's hard to ask because I feel like nobody, if you could guess what's going to happen in the future, we wouldn't. If either of us could guess what's going to happen in the future, we wouldn't be doing this podcast right now. We'd be on a beach or something, right? But
Right,
how do
right.
you generally feel about the future of hemp and cannabis reform going forward with the change of administration at a federal level?
Yeah. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, if you looked at the campaign promises, neither candidate really spoke much about cannabis, but when they
Mhm.
did, they were both about reform. We'll see how that plays out, but knock on wood, I don't see a reversal there. But we're at a very, very, very critical juncture. One thing I like, I think this industry is can be confusing and stressful and rapidly evolving, and there's all these conflicts and whatnot. But what I think, that's sort of the trees. But if you step back and look at the forest, what we're looking at now is a golden age of cannabis. I mean, this is a real cannabis renaissance. Looking back 20, 30, 50 years from now to the point that we're in right now, I think what you'll see is it was a critical juncture. Um, and B, that this was a golden age. And so the question is, are we going to be able to carry that golden age forward in a way that's meaningful so that products are safe and people have access and small business can participate? Or did we really mess it up? And did we mess it up by restricting it, by putting cannabis back in the box, or by giving it away to corporate conglomerates? And that's what remains to be seen. And I have some, again, cautious optimism that we're on the right path.
Yeah, well, that's an awesome thought. Just to end, whatever happens going forward, and I do believe, like you say, these are the good times, like right now. Like this is the golden age, and it's going to be interesting where we move forward. And hopefully we don't move forward with like any restrictions on products like these. But what I think, and I've been trying to say this more often, like especially with the threat of of a ban in Illinois, is whatever they do, let's say they ban it, God forbid, knock on wood, that doesn't happen. I will never forget what happened. Like this happened. I could buy as many sodas as I want to my house using my credit card. No, like no limits, like all of these things that it blew away my experience as a consumer. I've participated in many state cannabis markets. And one of the thoughts that have always stuck with me was my first experience when I went into a dispensary and I was like, I want that, 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 and that. And they're like, whoa, 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 you're over your limit. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? I'm at the store. And so like that's one of the reasons, like just simply right there, why I'm so in love with him, because it just decimated something as simple as that. Having to go to the dispensary, you can get it delivered to you. Like I don't have to go to the store anymore. Like if I don't want to, if I want to, I can. I don't know. That's my closing thought there is God forbid they take it away, but if they do, I'll never forget it happened.
I love that. That's right. It's good to hear from you, what motivates you. Again, you take deep dives. You're willing to bring on, people from different stripes and different backgrounds and areas of expertise and really engage with them. And, like you said at the beginning, you don't have a dog in the fight in terms of owning a business. You're a consumer. You like and appreciate cannabis. And I love hearing that, you went in to a dispensary and for the first time, we've all had that experience. We walk in, it's like, wow. And then, oh, wait, I can't buy this much. There's this problem. Oh, I can't, use my credit card, there's all these problems with the dispensary model. It's the only place I can get it. I can't get,
Hmm.
and so to be able to say, oh, wait a second, now I can order it online. I can go to, all sorts of different shops. I can, have all this array of products. I think it's great to hear from you. And I really appreciate, Cole, what you're doing and the education that you're putting out there, the advocacy for the plant that you're doing. It's really meaningful. And I appreciate your mission and what you're doing.
Thank you. That really means a lot because I'm a huge fan. And I guess just to like very briefly round out my point on why I thought all those things that you just recapped were so cool is because in the past, when I asked the question, why is there a purchase limit? Why are there possession caps? Why are there dosage caps? I've kind of been told my ideas are pipe dreams. Like, why are you asking those questions? Just be happy with what you have. And it's like, that's when this happened. It's like, no, it is possible. I lived in a world where that was possible, and frankly, nothing bad happened. The sky didn't fall. It was pretty
Right,
freaking
right.
awesome. So, no,
That's exactly right.
seriously.
Yeah. The clouds broke and the sun came through, and it was, yeah, no, exactly
Yeah.
the opposite of the sky falling for sure.
Yeah, literally. So thank you seriously for the kind words. I appreciate you so much, Rod. I wanted to just give you the space. Anything you want to say before we go?
Just I would say to those of you that are watching, first of all, thanks for watching and taking the time, and secondly, stop thinking in terms of hemp and marijuana and one path versus the other and which is better and blah blah blah. It's one plant, and we are on a great path towards legalization, and I think we need to support all the paths, and stop this infighting, and that's easier said than done, but really, my main point is to understand that it's, hemp is what I believe to be, the way, the better path towards the legalization, the world that Cole just described, where consumers have access, businesses have access. And it doesn't mean we need to stop on the rescheduling front. That's incredibly important. But it's all kind of coming together. And let's do it in the way that makes the most sense, for human beings who have evolved with this plant and need it in our lives.
Yeah. Well said. Well said, Rod. Well, folks, I hope you found as much value in this conversation as I did. We'll see you in the next episode of the Cole Memo. Take care, everybody.